The galaxy has its secrets, its impenetrable mysteries. It knows infinite species, each with its peculiarities, its strengths and weaknesses. But there is something about humans that no one expected, something that unsettles the brightest minds in the cosmos. No, it's not their weapons or superior intelligence. No, that would be easy to deal with. The real mystery is something simpler, something far more dangerous to the universe. Humanity is, somehow, impossible to kill. And no, it's not a matter of brute strength or resilience. It's something that defies all the rules of physics, logic, and probability. The Intergalactic Assassins Guild, with a 99.8% success rate in its contracts, cannot even scratch the surface of our existence. Millions of years of strategy, advanced science, and revolutionary technology have failed to overcome one simple phenomenon: human survival. How does a species that seems to be in constant failure, facing accidents and fatalities, manage to emerge unscathed where even the most formidable creatures in the universe fall? What happens when the logic of cosmic calculations collapses? And the greatest mystery is humanity itself. What would you do if you knew that reality bends around us and that the probability of our survival is, in fact, reversed? But this isn't just a mystery for scientists or high-ranking diplomats. It's a question that anyone living in the galaxy must ask. After all, in a universe where all others have failed, why do humans continue to adapt, reinvent themselves, and, most surprisingly, stay alive? The answer is closer than we think, and it begins in a place far simpler than most would like to admit. Humanity, at its core, has always been a mystery to the other civilizations of the galaxy. A relatively new race in the intergalactic scene, yet one that somehow was never fully dismissed or underestimated. When compared to cosmic empires that have lasted millennia, to beings whose technologies are beyond comprehension, humans should have been easy to deal with. They should have been. And yet, there was something unusual, something inexplicable, and yes, almost incomprehensible about them. They possessed a peculiar ability, a resistance to fatal events that made no sense. Probability dictated one outcome, but reality bent toward another. Somehow humans seemed indestructible. In the great intergalactic councils among the oldest civilizations, there was always the same subtle curiosity about humanity. How was it possible that a species seemingly so vulnerable, with fragile bodies and fickle minds, had this capacity for survival? An enigmatic mystery. While distant worlds were ruled by the cold logic of probabilities, humans, in their simplicity, seemed to defy mathematics and reason, and that started to bother people. It wasn't that they were powerful, but their survival was, in itself, an inexplicable phenomenon. At some point, a doubt arose among the most advanced societies. What is wrong with humans? It certainly wasn't strength, nor intelligence. But there was something about the way they adapted, the way they reacted to the unexpected, that unsettled the greatest minds in the cosmos. On planets governed by order and calculation, the chaos brought by human presence was so deeply disturbing that some began to wonder if it was truly possible to eradicate humans once and for all. But the problem was simple. The very concept of killing a human became an impossible mission. Of all the civilizations the Intergalactic Assassins Guild had attempted to exterminate, with its staggering 99.8% success rate, humans were the exception, the statistical anomaly. Every failed assassination attempt created yet another black hole of questions and failures. How could this be? A plausible explanation never emerged. Scholars, scientists, and even expert assassins began to wonder, what lies behind this human phenomenon? What allows humanity to bend the odds in its favor? Through the halls of galactic conferences and the secret meetings of interplanetary strategists, whispers began to grow. As time passed and failed attempts to eliminate humans continued to pile up, a theory started to gain traction. Perhaps humanity was not just an anomaly, but an evolution of chaos itself. A kind of error of nature that, instead of fading away, like so many other cosmic mistakes, had become the key to its own survival. In a galaxy where everything could be explained by laws and formulas, No one knew what to do with this. They were cosmic chaos in flesh and blood. But how, after all, could one hope to understand a phenomenon so unpredictable? The answer to this question, which would begin to unfold on distant planets, would have implications that would affect even the most advanced artificial intelligence systems. However, before the matter was resolved, something even more curious would happen, something that would add an even more unusual tone to the human predicament. And like a roll of the dice from fate, the answer would begin to take shape in an unexpected place. Meanwhile, a simple man, unaware, was about to become an intergalactic legend. And this man was, in fact, the key to a mystery that no one, even today, can fully explain. Ambassador Kirix, with his translucent skin and eyes that reflected entire galaxies, could not believe what the data was showing him. For half a century, no human had been successfully eliminated by the Intergalactic Assassins Guild. Not a single one. This was something that defied all logic of probabilities. For an entity that, for millennia, had the power to eliminate even the most complex galactic creatures with a mere gesture, this should have been impossible. Yet there he was, reporting a problem for which there was no plausible explanation. Kirix, exasperated, saw no rational way to approach the situation. He had always trusted statistics. Probability was an ally, an invaluable tool in resolving any cosmic issue, whether diplomatic or military. Simple mathematics dictated that after so many failed attempts, the assassin's success rate should be inevitable. But when it came to humans, the scenario was completely different. How is this possible? He asked himself, looking at the numbers once again. But the dilemma only deepened. It wasn't for lack of trying, as he would soon discover. The problem was that humans had a sort of innate talent for surviving the impossible. Something that could not be calculated. Madison, an experienced human agent, smiled. An ironic smile that exuded a disconcerting calm. Well, Kirix, it's not that we're smarter, stronger, or faster than any other species. It just so happens that we have a unique talent. Call it the human factor, natural chaos, or whatever else you want. But one thing is certain. Whenever death comes after us, it seems that math simply stops working. It's like the odds are reversed when it comes to humans. In the end, the more absurd the situation, the more likely we are to survive. Kirix stared at her in disbelief. He was a diplomat, accustomed to dealing with the unpredictable, but this went beyond any reasonable limit. But this makes no sense. How is it possible? He countered, more to himself than to Madison. Weren't you nearly annihilated in an interplanetary war? How can you survive such extreme situations and still come out unscathed? Madison shrugged, as if she had heard the same question thousands of times before. And who better to explain it than a human, Kirix? She paused, gazed into the vast emptiness of the stars, and continued. For us, it's simple. We survive because, well, that's what we do. Our adaptation to adversity is more than just a matter of will. It's a human phenomenon. And the reality, as frustrating as it was for such evolved and intelligent beings, was that the situation was far from something that could be solved with pure logic. The data didn't make sense. The statistics were simple and clear, but whatever. Force was behind human existence was beyond common understanding. The Assassin's Guild had failed countless times, but instead of giving up, they seemed even more motivated to find a way to solve the human enigma. It was as if each failure only fueled their curiosity. Over the years, those who studied the phenomenon encountered something even more baffling. Humans were not just survivors, they were catalysts for failures and accidents that affected the entire galaxy. As if in some way, human existence was intrinsically linked to the chaos and improbability that governed the universe itself. This was not just a statistical anomaly, no. This was something deeper, a fundamental principle of human existence. The very notion of probability seemed to invert when a person from Earth was involved. This left intergalactic scientists even more perplexed. And so, Madison continued with a sly smile, what else do you suggest? That mathematicians and statisticians try to calculate the human factor? They'll only get more frustrated? The failures you see in our survival aren't failures. They are the rule. Kirix, frustrated, didn't know whether this was a cruel joke or a sincere explanation. He still couldn't believe that something so improbable could be real. But somewhere, deep in his mind, he knew. Humanity was an enigma, an aberration that no one could decipher. But in a universe where even the most logical events could be distorted by a single race, what could happen when this mystery spread beyond the limits of the solar system? What would be the implications for the rest of the galaxy if the flaws and accidents that accompanied humans spread even faster? And what would be the next attempt to deal with it? Derek Thompson was, at first glance, an ordinary man. A library janitor in Milwaukee with his simple clothes, a friendly smile, and a routine that few would consider memorable. His life was nothing more than a predictable sequence of routine days, with deadlines to clean, shelves to organize, and a few quick conversations with the customers who walked in. He had no idea that fate was about to place him at the center of an intergalactic phenomenon. There was nothing grand or extraordinary about Derek, and perhaps that was what made him so dangerous. His humility was the key to what would become one of the greatest enigmas in the galaxy. On a day that seemed like any other, the Intergalactic Assassins Guild received an insane contract: eliminate Derek Thompson. The target, a janitor. The reason? No valid explanation seemed sufficient, but the fact that humans were a plague, an immortality in flesh, was reason enough. The Guild, with its army of renowned and highly trained assassins, was preparing for yet another mission. This time, no one could fail. They could not afford to lose to a human again. The assassin sent to eliminate Derek was none other than the Shadow of Seven Moons, one of the Guild's deadliest agents, whose ability for absolute silence and surgical precision was legendary across the galaxy. The mission seemed too simple to fail. The Shadow had eliminated targets on dozens of planets and, until that moment, had never failed. With a poisoned blade in hand and a flawless approach planned for the night, he was confident that this would be yet another successful mission to add to his long list of victories. Defeat was never an option. But, as everyone knows, when you start to feel invincible, chaos approaches in ways no one expects. The approach was silent and efficient. But at the decisive moment, what seemed like a flawless execution turned into a complete disaster. Derek, distracted by his task of mopping the library floor, slipped on a small puddle of water. What seemed like a simple accident was all it took for the Shadow to fail miserably. Instead of being eliminated, the assassin was struck by the handle of Derek's mop in such an unexpected and clumsy way that even he, who prided himself on never making mistakes, couldn't avoid the fall. The assassin was sent flying backward, crashing into a pile of books buried under cheap novels, and shattering his own weapon in the process. And what did Derek, an ordinary janitor, do in the face of the galaxy's greatest assassin now out of commission? He didn't panic. He didn't feel threatened. Nothing. Derek simply called the library's security to help the poor guy who was lying among the books. Meanwhile, he returned to his cleaning task, as if nothing had happened, as if it were just another day at work. For him, nothing had changed. But for the Assassins Guild, something had changed irreversibly. Something that even the most powerful in the galaxy could not have predicted. The failure was, of course, reported to the Assassins Guild, but, as always, no one wanted to believe that such a colossal failure had been caused by a mere accident. After all, what had happened there defied not only statistics, but the very laws of physics and fate. How could a simple mistake, a mere slip, ruin such a precise mission? How could an ordinary man so insignificant defeat what the cosmos considered one of the greatest assassins of all time? The most incomprehensible thing of all was that Derek had no idea what had happened. To him, it was nothing more than a regular afternoon at work. But as soon as the Guild realized they had failed in the face of a force as trivial as the banality of a human accident, they began to question whether they were witnessing a new reality. Humans, far from being easy prey, were proving to be the most unpredictable thing in the universe. And for a being like Derek Thompson, with his simple and unassuming life, intergalactic destiny was now in his hands, without him having the slightest clue. It was the beginning of a legend that no one knew was about to be written. And of course, this would not be the end of the assassination attempts. Actually, it was only the beginning of something much greater, something that the Guild and even the most brilliant strategists in the galaxy could not yet comprehend. The Assassin Guild's failure to deal with humanity was not just a blow to its reputation, it was a matter of honor. Every failed attempt to eliminate a human was like a rusted dagger plunged into the intergalactic ego of an organization known for its surgical precision and infallible methods. But the more they tried, the more assassinations against humans became, well, absurd. A series of failures so ridiculous and unexpected that it felt more like a comedy than a string of deadly missions. First, there was the banana peel incident. One of the assassins, a terrifying-looking being with unparalleled hand-to-hand combat skills, was sent to eliminate a human scientist working in a space lab orbiting the planet Zeus 9. The mission seemed simple: a single target, no significant defenses, and a stealthy approach to avoid detection. The plan was going smoothly until, as the assassin moved in for the kill, he slipped on a banana peel that had been carelessly left in the corridor. The result? A disastrous fall from a floating skyscraper, leaving the assassin reduced to a heap of bones and metal. No one ever figured out how the peel got there, but one thing was certain: he would never harm anyone again. And then there was the hot coffee. Ah yes, the coffee. One of the Guild's most calculating assassins was sent to take out a target at a busy cafe in a luxury space station. The plan was simple: poison the coffee, offering the target a cup laced with a lethal dose of neurotoxins. But the execution was a disaster. The assassin had barely added the poison when, by accident, he knocked the cup over. The coffee, already scalding hot, destroyed the molecular structure of the poison, rendering it completely harmless. The target, a diplomat from a powerful race, not only survived, but also mocked the assassin, leaving him with a sense of failure deeper than any weapon could inflict. The blunders continued. Another assassin was sent to an intergalactic gala event, tasked with infiltrating the crowd and eliminating a high-profile human political leader. But as fate seemed to enjoy toying with the Guild's plans, the assassin was mistaken for a volunteer and recruited to serve coffee to the guests. During the event, he found himself in an increasingly awkward situation, hiding behind trays of hors d'oeuvres while trying to approach his target. In the end, he was exposed, not because of his lethal blade, but because he was caught helping guests find their seats. His failure wasn't physical, it was entirely social. Of course, there were also the more technological attempts. The Guild had learned that manipulating probabilities was a dangerous game. But what other choice did they have when the odds were so clearly stacked against them? So they resorted to what they believed was the ultimate solution: quantum probability manipulation and interdimensional targeting. Using ultra-advanced technology, they attempted to warp the very fabric of reality to guarantee the death of a human. The mission was about to succeed when, at the last second, reality became so distorted that the assassins began seeing themselves in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mission failed once again, and the assassins vanished into the manipulated probabilities, trapped in an infinite loop of self-reflection that never led them back. What seemed even more impossible was that as the attempts grew more extravagant and complex, the failures only multiplied. It was as if the very nature of humanity was creating an unforeseeable resistance. Each attempt was becoming more absurd than the last, and no one knew whether this was just a series of catastrophic blunders or if it was humanity itself, with its constant adaptation and reinvention, that was somehow interfering with cosmic chaos. And while all of this was happening, Derek Thompson, the janitor from Milwaukee, continued living his simple life, completely unaware. For him, the concerns were the same as those of any other ordinary human. How many books he needed to clean that day, how many books needed to be returned to the system, and whether the cafe down the street had the best coffee that morning. But beneath the surface of what seemed like a meaningless fate, his existence was more intertwined with the destiny of the galaxy than anyone could have imagined. What was really happening here? Something about Derek, something about his humanity, seemed to defy the very laws of probability. It was no coincidence, but an inexplicable phenomenon that neither the Assassin's Guild nor the greatest geniuses of the galaxy could predict or control. And that made them more desperate than any previous failure. The growing sequence of failed assassination attempts against humans caught the attention of intergalactic scientists. With their rigorous analyses and advanced probability machines, they began searching for an explanation for the human phenomenon. The initial conclusion was simple. The human factor, that unique characteristic that allowed humans to survive the most improbable and catastrophic situations, needed to be studied. But soon, scholars realized they were facing something more complex and disturbing than they could have imagined. It wasn't just a unique ability to adapt. It was almost as if humans were designed to rewrite the rules of probability. A team of scientists from the Galactic Confederation conducted a detailed analysis of human survival in catastrophic events. They started with the simplest data: falls from great heights, failures in vital bodily systems, space accidents, and even alien attacks. To everyone's surprise, they began to notice a pattern. Humans, even in situations that should result in instant death or irreparable damage, seem to have a survival rate far higher than any other species. Some statistics showed humans falling from Earth's orbit and, instead of succumbing to the impact, surviving with nothing but a scratch. It was as if reality itself was protecting humans, bending in some way to ensure their survival. The question that arose, however, was even more bizarre. Scientists began to realize that humans were breaking the rules of physics and biology in ways that defied logic. Documented cases included humans being considered dead for hours and then simply waking up, suffering no more than a mild headache, only to complain about being hungry. The conventional explanation, a failure in medical systems or an incorrect diagnosis of death, simply did not apply. Something deeper was happening. Probability seemed to reverse when it came to humans. Instead of dying when the odds pointed to certain death, they thrived in extreme conditions. And then, when an experiment on probability manipulation was conducted, the theory of the human factor began to take shape. The experiment consisted of a series of hypothetical scenarios, all designed to test human resilience under impossible circumstances: falls from great heights, spaceship accidents, poisonings, and even exposure to lethal radiation. The intention was simple: to calculate the chances of survival in each situation based on statistics from other species. But unlike any other creature in the cosmos, humans began to show a survival rate that, if not for the strictness of the data, could be considered fraudulent. The phenomenon started being described in almost mystical terms. The more extreme and catastrophic the situation, the stronger human resilience seemed to become. Scientists, astonished, began to gather around a new theory. Humanity was not just an ordinary species, but a species capable of generating chaos and anomaly. The probability of failure did not apply to them in the same way it did to other species. Rather than collapsing under the pressure of the universe's laws, humans seemed in some way to be catalysts of improbability, as if fate itself bent to give them a chance to survive. The idea of inverted probability became a central area of study. Humans, it appeared, would not only survive where other species perished, but would also be capable of forging the impossible, emerging from each disaster stronger, smarter, and more adaptable. This discovery sparked a series of heated debates among the greatest thinkers in the galaxy. Some suggested that humans were the product of an evolutionary error, a flaw in the code of life that produced beings so resilient and dangerous that they defied the cosmic order. Others, more theoretical, speculated that humanity was not an accident, but a species chosen to play a more significant role in the universe's future. And there were even those who believed that humans were, in fact, a form of universal intelligence designed to correct flaws in the fabric of space-time, possessing an innate ability to alter reality around them. Meanwhile, across the stars, the Assassin's Guild grew increasingly perplexed, trying to understand how any human, no matter how simple or insignificant, seemed capable of escaping death. What once seemed like a simple and straightforward matter had now become a cosmic obsession. There were no more easy answers. The human factor theory opened an abyss of possibilities, but offered no definitive explanation. What seemed certain was that as the galaxy tried to understand humans, one thing became increasingly clear. Humanity was not just a species to be observed. They were about to redefine the very concept of survival. Derek Thompson, the janitor from Milwaukee, unknowingly stood at the center of it all. He was nothing more than an ordinary man, living an ordinary life on an ordinary planet. But his existence was the key to a universal phenomenon that no one, not even the oldest civilizations in the cosmos, could comprehend. And to him, none of it mattered. The only thing that did was the floor he had to clean at the library. After decades of failed attempts and blunders more absurd than they dared admit, the Assassin's Guild made an unprecedented decision. Once feared and respected for its ability to eliminate any target without exception, the organization had become haunted by its own inability to fulfill contracts against humans. The failure of their missions defied scientific explanation or strategic logic. It was as if, somewhere in the fabric of reality, an inexplicable force was sabotaging their operations. And so, in a move that shocked the universe, the Guild decided to change course, not to keep trying to kill humans, but somehow to help them live. Thus emerged a new policy, one no one could have predicted: the Assassins of the Intergalactic. Assassin's Guild were now, in essence, public health agents, but not in a direct way. They weren't there to cure diseases or actively protect lives. No. Instead, they began sending polite letters, elegant letters, typically diplomatic, with a hint of disdain behind the words, but with good intentions, or at least the intention of not failing yet another mission. Each one contained suggestions and tips on personal safety, as if the assassins were offering advice on how to avoid an accidental death, but of course with that certain brand of intergalactic sarcasm only the Guild could deliver. The letters always began with "Dear" target's name, followed by a series of recommendations on what humans could do to improve their health and, more importantly, avoid invisible cosmic risks. Avoid prolonged exposure to the sun, they advised in golden lettering, or be careful with slippery stairs, always accompanied by the Guild's discreet logo. In other words, the assassins were, in some strange way, trying to protect their targets from mundane accidents that, in the human world, could prove fatal. For the assassins, the irony was boundless. Their enemies weren't dying at their hands, but from these seemingly trivial mishaps of everyday life. But then something even stranger happened. Instead of being dismissed or ridiculed, the letters started being taken seriously by humans. They became popular across many systems, not as assassination warnings, but as public safety tips that even governments began to adopt. The phenomenon was observed with fascination throughout the galaxy, as human mortality rates unexpectedly dropped. Somehow, the assassins were inadvertently saving lives. People became more aware of daily risks, and as ironic as it was, the Guild was now contributing more to human survival than to their extinction. Derek Thompson, as always, had no idea that this strategic shift had anything to do with him or his species. To him, it was just another part of daily life. You go to work, mop the floors, organize the bookshelves, and don't think much about what's happening beyond your small, quiet existence. Yet, on a cosmic level, humanity was causing an unforeseen upheaval in intergalactic policies. It was no longer about destroying humans, but about ensuring they continued to survive. But, as always, failure was at the heart of it all. The Guild's failure to understand the very nature of human existence. The real issue was that no one could fully grasp how such a common, simple species managed to survive so incredibly. Even the insurance market began to benefit from this new approach. With cosmic risks increasing and the probability of death dropping, the Guild saw a new business opportunity. They founded Improbability Insurance and Human Safety Tips LLC, a specialized insurance company offering personalized packages for humans, covering everything from trivial accidents to the most absurd interplanetary disasters. Humans were naturally fascinated by the offerings, signing insurance contracts en masse, and, ironically, causing the guild's profits to skyrocket to unprecedented levels. The irony, however, was that the Assassin's Guild was no longer at war with humanity, but was now being paid to ensure its survival. This change in direction caused a cosmic shock, especially among those who still saw humans as a threat. How could an organization of assassins, known for its cruelty and precision, suddenly become an agent of public welfare? And, more importantly, what did this mean for the future of intergalactic relations? How could the galaxy, a vast empire of ancient and powerful civilizations, deal with a species that, however unassuming, was unintentionally disrupting the cosmic balance of power? The truth was that as the Guild tried to escape the deadly stalemate it had faced, they began to realize that assassination had never really been the problem. What terrified them now was the chaos that humanity caused simply by existing. And while all of this unfolded across intergalactic space, Derek Thompson continued his simple life. He had no idea that the polite letters he received every month were actually linked to a historic turning point in the galaxy. To him, it was just good advice on how to avoid slipping on the stairs. But deep down, everyone knew that human chaos was only just beginning. Their improbable survival was becoming the greatest enigma the galaxy had ever faced. The already baffling situation with humans took an even more unexpected turn when the Galactic Confederation realized that the issue wasn't just about human survival, it was about unpredictability. The stellar nations, which had always managed to handle any threat or challenge through complex calculations and meticulously planned strategies, started to see that the rules of the game were changing. Humans, with their propensity for chaos and improbability, didn't fit into any intergalactic diplomacy model. To the leaders of the cosmic powers, humans were a true anomaly, not because they were powerful or threatening, but precisely because no one could predict what they would do next. Chaos took on a new form during a major diplomatic summit of the Confederation. The event, intended to discuss peace agreements between the galaxy's greatest civilizations, was suddenly disrupted by an unforeseen factor. Madison, a human with no political significance, accidentally infiltrated an ultra-secret session. This happened because, while trying to find a vending machine, she stumbled upon a hidden door. Without realizing the gravity of the situation, she walked into the room where the galaxy's leaders were gathered and, in an utterly nonchalant manner, took a seat, oblivious to the tense atmosphere of the meeting. No one knew what to do. The security forces had no idea how to handle her, and the alien leaders, all sophisticated and diplomatic, couldn't understand how a mere human had bypassed so many layers of security. She seemed like an error, a fluke. But in reality, she was about to cause an unprecedented diplomatic crisis. Madison had no idea what was happening. In fact, she barely knew where she was. All she wanted was a little peace and a cup of coffee. However, her unexpected presence threw the intergalactic delegations into turmoil. The leaders, initially visibly annoyed, began to wonder how a species with such a low level of development could be capable of such bewildering actions. Human behavior always seemed to disrupt even the most precise calculations and destabilize any carefully planned meeting. Conferences that, under normal circumstances, would have been filled with complex agreements and refined diplomacy were now being dominated by something entirely unpredictable: the erratic nature of humans. The real diplomatic crisis began when the galaxy's probability masters, considered the greatest mathematical and strategic geniuses in the universe, were called in to analyze human behavior. Their task was to predict how such a simple yet chaotic race could possibly affect the galactic balance. But instead of providing answers, 3 of these masters collapsed nervously after multiple failed attempts to calculate any human action. Humans were breaking their formulas. It was as if the entire foundation of mathematical and statistical knowledge in the galaxy had suddenly become irrelevant, as if humans existed outside of any equation and simply followed their own unpredictable path. The attempts at conventional strategy began failing in hilariously baffling ways. The Confederation tried to impose a series of restrictions on humans, such as interplanetary limits, but soon discovered that any imposed limit only generated more chaos and disorder, causing humans to expand in unforeseen ways. They were going places no one had ever thought to look, colonizing seemingly impossible worlds and surviving in conditions that defied every pre-existing theory. Even the most basic concepts of galactic diplomacy seemed to make no sense when humans were involved. The galactic leaders then came to a terrifying conclusion. Humans were unpredictable in ways they could not control, and that somehow made them a threat to the established order. However, at the same time, humans were not a military threat, nor did they possess weaponry that made them a force to be feared. No. The real terror was their unique ability to create chaos, something that did not fit into the calculable formulas and logical order of galactic civilizations. To the most experienced aliens, it was as if humans were drawing a new geometry, one where probability and logic did not follow the rules. In the minds of the Galactic Confederation's leaders, something else was taking shape. Humanity should neither be destroyed nor conquered. In fact, their unpredictability could be used as a strategic advantage, but only if the galaxy could find a way to adapt to their existence. The problem, of course, was that no one knew how to do that. Humanity was beyond all expectations, beyond all theories. It was a living phenomenon, not something that could be understood or controlled. And meanwhile, at the center of the chaos, Madison, with her carefree demeanor, was unknowingly paving the way for the galaxy's future. Derek Thompson, once again, was far removed from all this confusion. To him, intergalactic matters were irrelevant. However, what he did not know was that somewhere among the stars, his species was causing a cosmic collapse, not through strength or intelligence, but through their unique ability to simply be. And the Confederation, now facing an enigma within its own system of calculations, knew that the future of the galaxy depended on an answer that was right in front of their eyes: the humans. The universe had always been a complex machine, a fabric of calculated probabilities and predictable variables, where every action generated a reaction that could be measured with precision. But, as we all know, even the best constructed machines can have their bugs. What no one predicted, however, was that humanity would become such an unpredictable species that somehow they would end up fixing reality itself. This happened during an unprecedented intergalactic crisis, during a diplomatic meeting that became the epicenter of a catastrophic cosmic failure. What intergalactic scientists called the quantum core catastrophic failure happened suddenly. A collapse in the fundamental structure of reality that threatened to annihilate the entire galaxy and all its possibilities. Panic spread like wildfire among the most advanced races in the galaxy. Diplomatic leaders entered emergency mode, with scientists rushing to quantum consoles to try to understand what was happening. The galaxy's quantum core, a kind of energetic heart that sustained cosmic order, was on the verge of collapsing. If this collapse occurred, the entire structure of reality would disintegrate, plunging the entire universe into a state of absolute chaos. The probability of survival, for any living being or civilization, was 0%. And then, in the middle of this turmoil, without knowing what she was doing, Madison, yes, her, stepped in. With the same calm she had while drinking her coffee every morning, Madison suggested a solution that no one else had considered. When the red alert sounded, the room fell into absolute silence, everyone anxiously awaiting the final word from renowned intergalactic scientists. But Madison, with a simple and nonchalant, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" defied logic with the utmost ease. And as if the simple act of pausing the energy flow could make all the difference, she stood up and walked over to the control panel, pressing the off button. A few seconds later, she pressed the on button again, waiting, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, yet without any real logical reasoning behind the act. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. The quantum core stabilized. There was no scientific explanation. There were no calculations or variables that could justify what had just happened. The catastrophic failure had been fixed, but not by any quantum theory. nor by any advanced cosmic control skill. No, the solution came through a technique so simple it seemed like a mistake, a flaw in the understanding of universal complexity. Something as mundane as pressing an on and off button, like a basic IT trick, was what prevented the destruction of the universe. The intergalactic scientists were in shock. They, the greatest geniuses of the galaxy, with decades of study on quantum and universal mechanisms, were baffled by such a simple human error, one that somehow had solved the greatest quantum disaster the galaxy had ever faced. They wondered, how could something as primitive as a turn-it-off-and-on-again solution have worked where all intergalactic science and complexity had failed? For many, the answer wasn't in the how, but in the why. How could humans be so ineffable, so bewildering, that even the laws of physics and galactic logic seemed to bend to their way of being? The fact that Madison, unintentionally, had resolved the crisis with something so trivial and simple made the phenomenon even more unsettling. She had no training to deal with quantum problems, nor did she even know what was happening at the time. It was a reflection of human singularity, their unique ability to solve the greatest mysteries of the cosmos by accident, often without even knowing how. The entire galaxy, which relied on the laws of probability, now found itself confronted with a species that somehow defied all those laws. This led to a new cycle of questions. How could humanity, which seemed so simple and vulnerable, manipulate probabilities so intensely? And what if the secret to human survival was precisely this ability to create chaos where others saw order? The phenomenon was so unfathomable that no one knew whether it was a blessing or a curse for the universe. What was clear, however, was that humanity was creating fractures in the fabric of reality, and there was nothing the aliens could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Derek Thompson went on with his life. In his daily routine, he continued his janitorial duties, unaware that somewhere, his species was accidentally solving the greatest problem in the galaxy. He had no idea that humans had somehow corrected reality, but that was what made it all the more fascinating. And as cosmic chaos unfolded across the vast universe, the real question was, how could the galaxy control something so unpredictable, yet so essential to the very existence of reality? After years of unsuccessfully trying to eliminate humans, the Intergalactic Assassins Guild finally had to admit a bitter reality. The assassination attempts weren't working, and rather than continuing to fight against human improbability, perhaps it was time to adapt to the new cosmic order. As a highly efficient organization now frustrated by its continuous failures, the Guild saw a unique opportunity. If they couldn't kill humans, maybe they could profit from their survival. Thus was born one of the most innovative ideas in intergalactic history, the creation of Improbability Insurance and Human Safety Tips, LLC. Unexpectedly, this not only gave the Guild a new purpose, but also turned it into a prosperous empire, without needing to take a single life. The transition was, without a doubt, strange, but the numbers didn't lie. What started as an ironic response to the Guild's failure soon became a highly lucrative business model. Instead of assassination contracts, the Guild began offering cosmic life insurance packages, specifically tailored for humans. What was once considered a high-risk service in a galaxy where nothing seemed more uncertain than human survival quickly turned into one of the safest and most sought-after businesses. Surprisingly, many humans, aware of the improbability of their own survival, began signing up for plans to protect themselves from all possible threats, from galactic accidents to invisible cosmic dangers that even the greatest experts couldn't predict. At first, the Guild's letters caused some discomfort. Sent as polite suggestions, they started appearing in every human's mailbox. Avoid climbing ladders without assistance. Beware of sun exposure during the stellar cycle. To eat better, proper nutrient intake can increase your chances of survival. Ironically, these messages, which in any other context would have been ridiculous, began to make more sense to humans than any previous public health policy. The Assassins Guild, which was once synonymous with death and destruction, was now turning into a sort of cosmic health agency, with all its assassins downgraded to security consultants. As expected, the impact was profound. The the human mortality rate dropped dramatically. Humans, always so resistant to the odds, were now receiving practical and targeted advice to increase their chances of survival in a universe that seemed to have decided probability was against them. The concept of certain death no longer made sense when you had an assassin's guild that, for an affordable price, helped ensure you made it safely to the next stellar cycle. The paradox, of course, was how an organization specializing in killing had now become a bastion of protection. And for the guild, profits quickly soared. In just a few cycles, they had more humans purchasing security packages than ever before. Derek Thompson, a janitor from Milwaukee, was one of the first to receive the letters, though he didn't quite know what to make of them. In his simple mind, he thought they were just general public health guidelines, something useful to keep his life safer. He wasn't meant to understand the intergalactic complexities of what was happening. For Derek, the most important things were his daily job, his routine, and the idea of a peaceful life. But what he didn't know was that, without realizing it, he was at the center of a cosmic revolution. While he spent his days dusting off books and keeping the library clean, the universe was adjusting to human statistical anomalies. He had no idea that the choices he made every day, choosing good coffee, taking a break to breathe, and avoiding excessive sun exposure, were contributing to the improbable balance of the galaxy. The guild, of course, didn't stop there. They weren't fools. They knew that at some point, humans would start questioning all of this. How could an organization of assassins become public health specialists? So, to maintain their image, the guild went even further. Instead of just advising people on how to avoid accidents, they started ensuring their insurance packages covered unforeseen security failures and even random cosmic accidents. The idea that nothing was impossible for a human, not even avoiding death, spread like wildfire, and the guild's packages became essential for anyone looking to secure their survival in a universe where even the laws of physics were constantly shifting. The concept of unlikely survival began to be treated as a science, and the once feared Assassin's Guild was now seen as a trusted and respected institution. The greatest paradox of all, however, was that by embracing this new path, the Guild never had to kill a single human to succeed. They had found in human improbability a profitable and sustainable market. In the end, survival became one of the galaxy's largest industries. But while the Guild thrived, one question still lingered. What if the true reason for human survival was more than just luck or adaptation? What if the key lay in something much deeper, something the galaxy was only just beginning to understand? And so, what do you think? Has humanity truly discovered the key to defying cosmic chaos, or are we just at the mercy of a probability we have yet to comprehend? After all, how does such an improbable phenomenon persist in the universe? Human survival, this anomaly, continues to baffle the galaxy's brightest minds. But what can we learn from it? Maybe, just maybe, we are more than an unstable, chaotic species. Maybe, deep down, we are the masters of the improbable. And while the galaxy debates the implications of our existence, we continue, unknowingly, going about our daily lives. The story of Derek Thompson, from janitor to accidental savior of the galaxy, is just the beginning. But what about you? What do you think really keeps humans alive? What mysteries still lie behind our survival? The answer, like everything in the universe, might be right in front of your eyes. But don't worry, there's more. If you're curious about what happens when humans truly start challenging the laws of reality, there's plenty more to come. Stay with us and discover what the galaxy is trying to hide. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories from the universe. What's coming next? Are you going to miss out? Just click on the video beside you and get ready for another journey.